Track limits is a big talking point in Formula One at the moment. We had lots of debate and discussion about it in Austria. We're probably going to have it again this weekend at the French Grand Prix at Paul Ricard. And the drivers themselves have become very vocal on this subject. So we're going to get together now and scrutinise, shall we say, some of the things they've been coming out with. And Edd Straw and Scott Mitchell are here with me, Glenn Freeman, to see if we agree with, shall we say, the complaints from the drivers. And Scott, you can have the first one. We always hear drivers saying they want consistency with the way track limits and many other rules are policed. There have been changes for this year, so do the drivers have the consistency they've supposedly been asking for all this time?
Yeah, they do, which is why this part of the argument it's so frustrating, because for up until the end of last year, and I think this was a particular problem in 2021 under the race direction of Michael Massey, we had this. It wasn't a universal policy of police track limits corner by corner, but they were so much more liberal with applying corner specific regulations. Some places it was the white line, other places it was a curb. Some places it depended on the colour of the curb. Other places there were no policing of track limits at all, because there was a natural track limit, grass or gravel. So they just said we don't need to worry about it here. And this just got it got a little bit silly sometimes. The logic was pretty sound in terms of using the specific. No track is the same. No corners. No two corners are the same track to track. So it made sense, I guess, in a way, to try and adjust for what exactly the drivers were facing. But this just led to it was impossible from the outside to watch a driver go round a lap of any given circuit. And one corner they're going four wheels off the track, and the other the next they're having to keep it nice and tight. And you don't know, one's a penalty, one's not. So for this year, it changed, and it just became blanket policy. The white line polices track limits absolutely everywhere. And yes, sometimes there are some tracks where you think, oh, this seems a bit unnecessary, but it's exactly what the drivers, the teams, us fans were asking for. Can we just make this as clear as possible? They've done that now, and we're still getting people moaning about the way track limits are policed. But consistency, the way the rule is applied, they haven't got a leg to stand on in terms of complaining about that anymore.
Yeah, I think the white line is the edge of the track. Everywhere you go, the rules are interpreted and applied the same. That is absolutely fine with me. But Ed, we've already heard from the drivers that apparently this isn't the type of consistency they wanted. So what are they on about?
Well, it encapsulates the problem, doesn't it? It's this push and pull that happens eternally between wanting absolute, consistently applied rules and the fact that reality is unavoidably messy and imprecise. If you want the closest possible approximation to consistency, you have to have a clear rule that covers everything, applies everywhere, and you get penalties accordingly. If not, you have a more case-by-case interpretative approach, and that's been criticised in the past and caused problems. So it's just this eternal circle of reaction and counter-reaction. We bounce from one approach to the other. Neither is perfect. You have to go for one or the other and accept how it works. So drivers have asked for consistency. They've got it. They don't like it. And they probably won't like whatever reaction they request for this in the future. It just gets a bit silly going round and round in circles on this issue.
One thing we often hear from drivers is that we should stop messing around with curbs and white lines and runoff areas. And the go-to quote is just put a wall there and then we have a defined track limit. But if we have zero tolerance track limits with a white line, Ed, why can't the drivers just treat a white line as if it's a wall? At least then, if they get it wrong by accident, they don't smash their car up.
Well, it's true that a wall is a bit more evident than a 2D painted line or a very slightly 3D curb, so it's easier to see. But what really matters here is consequences, isn't it? Drivers will leave a bigger margin at Monaco or Baku because they know there's zero margin for error. The tolerance isn't there. The wall will absolutely impose the zero tolerance in its own destructive way. When you have a track limit that's not physical, you know there's a margin for error, doubly so if you're in a race situation where you can have 3 strikes before the 4th one that earns you the penalty. So both walls and a painted line are inelegant solutions. One's too destructive, the other one is almost too mild and encourages drivers to push that limit. So I do wonder if the trick here is coming up with some more all-encompassing curb technology that works for all types of cars and motorbikes, of course. Whether you can develop that is another question. Obviously, we've got sausage curbs, which can be the no tolerance limit, but drivers also don't like them because then they get punished with damage to bits of the car that they feels out of proportion with the offence. But remember, drivers will take liberties, whatever happens. If there isn't a wall there, they will do that. They engineer in a margin when there's a wall because it is your zero tolerance, damage-inducing hard surface.
And we've seen it in Austria actually before, where they put those, I think we call them baguette curbs, not sausage curbs, and they were running over them. That was effectively like a gentle version of a wall, and they all complained that they were damaging their cars. So I don't think the drivers... This is another argument where they don't have a leg to stand on, really. And the big problem, of course, with sausage curbs as well is that they're dangerous in the way they can launch cars. So if we have strict enforcement of the rules with white lines, perhaps we can get rid of sausage curbs and then the tracks are actually safer. But Scott, one new argument that we've heard in 2022 is that the drivers have worse visibility this year with the new cars and the fairings that are over the front wheels. Is that one where you can actually have some sympathy for the drivers?
This is probably the point where I can understand their point of view the most, because this was a pre-existing issue as well. When you've got a surface change underneath the car, that's obviously a lot easier to feel and judge your positioning against versus a painted white line. That has always been the case. If you're right up to the point where you're just about keeping one of your four wheels on the white line, I can imagine that in any F1 car, any single seater, your visibility is going to be so impaired that you're not going to know 100% for sure. But this year, with the bigger wheels, you've got the wheel covers as well. I think that is harder, and I am willing to extend a bit of sympathy towards the drivers on this one, because while the white line is basically motorsport and F1's equivalent of exactly that, the white lines in, say, football or tennis, it's not quite the same as that in motorsport, in racing, when you're in that 3D live situation. So I do have a degree of sympathy there, but where I limit that sympathy is that's kind of why you have multiple breaches that you're allowed to do before you get a penalty. So now you can cross that line a handful of times, and all you do is get a warning for it. It gets flagged up by the digital system. So if you're that great a driver, or your team is switched on and telling you, and you're not pushing back and ignorant about it, surely over the course of three or four breaches, you should be able to work out, okay, so that was too far. I need to remember that for next time, and then also rein yourself back in, give yourself a little bit more of that margin. So while I do have sympathy in this area, you have to draw a line somewhere and accept that you are being given a few of these almost like exemptions or jokers that you can use, breach the rule a few times while you get up to speed and learn exactly where that white line is.
Yeah, so that's as close as we're going to come then to perhaps some sympathy. And Scott, you raise a good point that in any modern single-seater, once you're sat in the cockpit, you can only just see the tops of your tyres. You certainly can't see the bottom. So being able to visibly judge it by looking at if your tyre's over the white line is impossible. The drivers have to get familiar with their surroundings. So let's finish with the big claim that came out of the Austrian Grand Prix weekend. It was made by Max Verstappen, but it's clear a lot of the drivers agreed with him. And this is the claim that all of these penalties that we had during the Austria weekend, and we're going to see it again this season if we continue to police it this strictly, is making F1 look bad. Scott, is the way we are currently policing track limits making F1 look bad?
No, it isn't. It is a silly accusation to make, because these are just very clearly defined rules being policed exactly as they're supposed to. And while I very rarely have sympathy for the FIA and share the view of the FIA, I kind of thought their pushback on this Verstappen comment in Austria was spot on, where they said, well, the number of penalties was just equal to the number of infringements. If you don't do this, then we're not going to give you a punishment. The drivers have the capacity here to control that. It's not like there's this crazy rule that no one can stick to or anything like that. It's not like the FIA have put this crazy draconian system in place where you just have cars being pinged left, right, and centre just for doing what every single car and driver does through any given corner. They're in specific places. The bit that is a bit different is that some of this will be track design specific. So if we get into a better place, motorsport as a whole, where track designs can be a bit smarter, they can introduce a few more natural track limits, then I think we would move away from this naturally. But until then, you need to find a way to police the situations that you have. F1 has that. The FIA is doing that. It's down to the drivers to adhere to that. So if anyone's making F1 look silly, it's the drivers for continually breaching in this way.
And also for constantly complaining about it. That's what grabs the headlines. Anecdotally, from what I've seen from fans, they prefer a white line as the limit offence because that's understandable, as was mentioned earlier. These times where one corner it was fine to do it, another it wasn't, was getting a lot of criticism in the past. That was making F1 look stupid. You have to remember, drivers will take whatever liberties they can. They'll reinterpret the whole shape of the corner if they can possibly get away with it. I think they complained as much as they did in Austria because turn 9 in Austria, the first of those two right-handers at the end of the lap, is particularly tricky. It's quite a quick corner. The track's falling away. The visibility is not great. So that is potentially the most difficult track limits corner on the whole of the circuit. But it's still all about drivers trying to get away with carrying as much pace through and not liking it when they get done for it. Any solution to track limits is imperfect. But if F1 doesn't want to look stupid, then perhaps the drivers need to accept what they've asked for and then just say, no, it's fine. Those are the rules. We know what we're doing. No problem.
Yeah, so there you go. We've tried to pick out what I think are the 5 main arguments coming from the drivers. We've given our verdicts. We want to hear your verdict in the comments as well. Do any of those arguments stack up for you? Are you on the side of the drivers or the side of the FIA? We gave the drivers some sympathy, I think, over the cockpit visibility one. But beyond that, I think the summary from us is clear. F1 drivers, we think you're talking rubbish.